see so many of you here today. Maybe it's the venue, maybe the speakers, maybe the topic has something to do with it. Anyway, everybody knows about social construction. It used to be a huge buzzword in the past. I wonder what the situation is today. Maybe it's going out of fashion as a word, but as a phenomenon, as an idea, it's not going to die anytime soon, I believe. And we will be asking questions about this thing of constructionism. The heading is what is real and what is social construction, and we have a very nice couple of speakers here today. Elder-Vass from Loughbourough University, or Loughbourough, and Olli Pyyhtinen from the University of Turku. They will address these issues from slightly different perspectives, and we have already tested a little bit of their differences and maybe disagreements. We'll see whether they are able to quarrel at all. Now, the thing is that there is a lot of unclarity and confusion around this thing. And I would say in one word, it's a huge mess, and it's just delightful that these guys have agreed to clean that mess for us. But let me start out with a few observations about what are we talking about. Here is a scheme or a general formula that might provide a point of departure. X is Z constructed by Y. So we have three variables there. And then the ambiguity, the huge degree of ambiguity related to this notion, social or whatever construction, relates to the ambiguity of these three variables. There's a number of different interpretations at play. And then we may ask on which of those interpretations of these three variables the idea of construction or constructionism would be a challenging novel insight, something interesting to be examined and explored, that to be taken seriously and things like that, or possibly just a trivial no news. I mean, on some of those interpretations there is nothing new yet. We already knew it, there is no need to have any quarrel around it. And then another question, do versions of this claim that X is Z constructed by Y imply some sort of philosophical ism, or maybe denial of some other isms, etc. And of course, here realism is one of the key issues. Does social constructionism imply denial of realism? Is it compatible with it, or so forth? Then question about what prompts, what gives rise to these ongoing debates around social or whatever construction, and then what role in these debates play ambiguity. I think much of the debate is just useless in the sense that had these ambiguities been cleaned up and clarified, there would be no need for debate. But sometimes it might be a matter of differences in philosophical outlook. People with different philosophical tastes have a different take on these issues. But these guys will be highlighting more on these and related questions. And I'll just simply repeat the questions that we three have agreed on to provide the agenda for today's conversation. So the speakers have been asked to address the following list of questions. This list has been delivered to others, including you, through the email in the past. Why should we care about social construction? Why is it interesting? What's the worth of the attention? What does the social in social construction stand for? Could we do without it? Is it just construction, or do we need to call it social construction? What is constructed? well, this is the white part in the scheme. How does construction occur? This is the Z part in the scheme. What forces lie behind construction, social or otherwise? How much construction is materials to be made commensurable or compatible? All right, I've done my share in paving the way for the two speakers, and we go in the order of interest and then follow. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to use your last slide to talk from. I'm going to try and offer some realist answers to these questions, which might be surprising because it's often been assumed or suggested that realism and social constructionism might not be compatible and might even be in conflict with each other. Perhaps that's encouraged by the fact that some prominent constructionists say things that appear to be quite anti-realist, and some, but not all of those, actually hold views that really are quite anti-realist. But I'm going to be arguing, as I did in this book, which started I've argued that constructionism is entirely compatible with a realist perspective on society, and indeed a coherent realism requires a version of social construction. Perhaps a version that abandons some of the more extreme things that have been claimed in social construction, but a version that retains the important parts of the argument. But let me address these questions. First of all, why do we care about social construction? And at the beginning of that, I think, is that it's simply impossible to understand many social phenomena adequately without recognizing that social construction plays a central role in those, in a vast range of those phenomena. An obvious place to start here is with the work of John Searle, who tells us that a whole range of important social institutions have what he calls a subjective ontology. They depend for their very existence, as well as on their particular character and properties, on the ways in which we think about them. And indeed, and here I think I want to be a touch clearer than Searle, they depend on the ways in which we can collectively conspire to think about them. I use this word conspire deliberately to kind of destabilize any notion that this process depends on our conscious motivated agreement to it. Very often we may be unknowing or perhaps even unwilling conspirators in the construction of certain social facts. But our de facto acceptance of, and indeed our de facto backing for, certain socially sanctioned ways of thinking, talking and acting makes us conspirators nevertheless in the construction of the social world. Why should we care? Well, first of all, as I suggested, because without a coherent concept of social construction, we can't understand many aspects of the social world. And secondly, because many of those socially constructed phenomena are vitally important to us all. So things like money, property, gender, nation, university degrees, absolutely vital to us all. How can we not care about something that lies behind those sorts of phenomena? And secondly, we should care because, or perhaps this is thirdly, we should care because once we recognize that these things are socially constructed, then it becomes clear that they could be constructed differently. And in particular, that many of these could be constructed in ways that are more or less oppressive, more or less conducive to human flourishing. So I think we should care about social construction. Let me move on then to the second question. What does the social in social construction stand for? What is social about social construction? And I think I've already started to answer that question with my talk of collective conspiracy. Property, for example, only exists because we collectively accept that it does. That acceptance leads to the action orientations that produce our decisions about how to act in cases where that notion of property is relevant. Our decisions about what to do or not to do in relation to the objects around us. It affects the decisions we make about mundane things like notebooks and pens and items of clothing, and much more socially significant things like houses and cars and stocks and shares and so on. So these orientations that affect our actions in a whole range of social contexts depend first of all on cognitive capacities that, as far as we know, are currently only possessed by humans. Social construction is something that only humans can do. And secondly, on the fact that via a variety of means of communication, we coordinate those action orientations and attitudes towards these socially constructed phenomena with other humans with whom we interact. It's not enough for one person, for example, to believe that property exists. If I think that property exists and therefore expect that no one else will take my coat and wear it, and no one else believes that, then there is no such thing as property. Property only comes about when we have a group of people who collectively accept that that's the case. All of these socially constructed things only come about when there is a group of people. A group of people who I'm going to briefly refer to as a discursive known circle, but that's something we might want to ask more about later, I guess. It agrees to think and talk in that particular way that sustains that particular social construction. And this, in the end, is what is social about social construction. That it depends upon groups of human beings interacting in particular ways that depend upon a history of communication and interaction between them. Is that redundant? Absolutely not. What sorts of things can be socially constructed? Well, I've mentioned a few already, haven't I? Perhaps it's worth saying that this is a point where realists start to part company with some of the more extreme social constructionists. Some of those more extreme constructionists sometimes say that anything and everything is socially constructed, often on the grounds of neo-Kantian arguments about the inaccessibility of a world beyond language or discourse. But for realists, there is a clear distinction between those things that can be socially constructed and those things that cannot. Those things that can be socially constructed are those things that have what's so-called a subjective ontology. They are things whose very existence depends upon the ways in which we think about them. But there are plenty of other things that don't. I must use the classic realist example, a table, a piece of furniture. Those things come into existence as a consequence of a social process, but once they've been created, they are there, whether we believe in them or not. And of course there are many more momentous things that equally exist independently of whether we collectively agree to believe in them or not. The sun, the stars, the sea, the temperature outside, all of those things are as they are, irrespective of what we choose to believe about them. So what is socially constructed is simply those things that depend for their existence on the ways in which we think and talk about them. How does it occur? Again, I've started to say quite a bit about that. Social construction is very much a discursive process. It depends upon a usually gradual process in which groups of people influence what individuals think. So the existence of property depends upon a process in which, over millennia, I guess, people have asserted rights about objects, come to accept what other people have asserted about their rights with regards to objects, and collectively and gradually built up a set of ways of thinking and talking and acting with regard to objects that we now think of as the concept of property, or the social phenomenon of property. So that's an important part of the answer. It's a discursive process. And I guess that my second part of my answer is also my answer to number 5, which is that the forces that lie behind social construction are partly the interpersonal processes of interaction that I've talked about. But it's also clear that social construction is something that is powerfully influenced by other major sources of social power. If we look at the construction of property today, for example, it's clear that the forms of property have been radically developed. The idea of digital property is particularly fascinating now. Lots of us have in our pockets these sorts of things. Oops, it doesn't go off, by the way. I don't have to do anything with them. And on these gadgets we can have music files. Now, if I want to put a music file on this, then there are people out there who will insist that I pay them for the privilege of doing that. Now, I own this gadget, I own all the bits and bytes inside it, I own the memory that's going to be reconfigured to make some sort of music file occur on it. But somehow the notion of property has been discursively reconfigured such that someone can have a property right in the pattern of bits and bytes on this gadget. And therefore I have to pay if I want to put that music file on my phone. So it's quite clear that the ways in which construction operates are shaped by major sources of social power. In this case, the power of the media corporations to influence the ways in which we collectively think, and the power of the state which they've managed to inveigle on their behalf. Okay, so let me then finish by talking again about this question of how constructionism and realism might be made commensurable or compatible. I'm going to address it as a question of how they might be made compatible. My first answer to that question is simply that everything that I've said so far in support of a moderate kind of social constructionism is thoroughly compatible with a realist understanding of the social world. This is a real causal process in a widely replicated form in which causal influence is exerted by a variety of interacting entities, people, organizations, the things I call norm circles, each of which has emergent causal powers as a consequence of its composition and structure. And the outcome of that process is a state of the world in which material entities, us human beings, come to have new mental properties that influence our subsequent actions. So social constructions depend for their continuing existence on the embodied properties of real material beings and the continuing beliefs they have about the interactive nature of their social environment. So this is a thoroughly real process, and it's hard to see how we can understand it in any terms other than those. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say how really honored and delighted I am to be here today. It was nice that you invited me here. And to keep things really simple, my talk will be pretty much structured around and by the questions we were asked to and we agreed to address in our talks. So, to the first one, why should we care about social construction? More than anything, I think constructionism cares about us. It's a forceful, liberating stance, as it is critical of the status quo, as I'm hacking it. It claims that an entity, object, idea, or category, or the way it is at present, is not a historical, eternal, unexchangeable, but has been brought into existence at some point and is also historically variable. So what this means, if we think of society, for example, is that constructionism suggests that the prevailing given social order is not inevitable and invariable, but has been produced or constructed over the course of history in the networks of power knowledge, as the Gordians would have it, for instance. What's more, this implies not only that in the past society may have been or has been organized or constructed differently, but that it also could be organized differently than it is at present. And they addressed the idea of being organized in a manner less oppressive, for instance. However, I also think that while constructionism cares about us and for us, we as well should indeed care about constructionism. And I mean this in two senses. The first of those senses has to do with the liberating effect I just mentioned. Although I acknowledge that constructionism may not be liberating for all. At best, constructionism may serve envisioning alternative ways of being, thinking and acting, to realize that things are not natural, inevitable and eternal, creates new possibilities for renewing our practices, for affecting and rearranging our existing relations and institutions. So in that sense, you should pay attention to constructionism, for it is good for you. The second sense in which I understand the issue of care, or caring about constructionism, could be perhaps expressed by what Heidegger talks about Sorge, or actually more precisely the Sorge. I mean concern. We need to concern for construction, and actually I'm concerned or troubled or worried about constructionism, especially social constructionism. What I mean by this is that construction should not be taken as a matter of fact, but rather as a matter of concern. As I see the plain fact that something is constructed is relatively uninteresting and doesn't require much insight. For instance, that money is a social construct or institutions, other kinds. There's not much insight required. The constructiveness of things should not be taken as a ready-made answer, but rather as a question, a problem to be examined and to be examined empirically. So to question number 2. What does the social in social construction stand for? Is it necessary or redundant? For me, the problem with social constructionism is that it tends to understand construction only in a metaphorical sense, not literally. And the literal meaning of construction, as Ian Hacking knows in his book The Social Construction of What, is building or assembling from parts. And as far as the study of concrete ways of producing things by building or assembling them from parts is concerned, I think that the term social becomes more or less redundant. Calling the practices of construction social adds hardly any extra value to their description. Apart from the fact that the process of construction doesn't take place or is not carried out by a solipsistic, isolated agent, but in relations or assemblages. So accordingly, by drawing on such authors as Isabel Stengers and Bruno Latour, the type of constructionism I'm arguing for, or I'm ready to argue for, or would be perhaps ready to argue for, can be labeled as material constructionism. Constructionism should not privilege language, discourse, and/or culture as the source of construction. Instead of assigning primary dynamism to the human realm, we should also take seriously the agency, or to put it more moderately, effectivity of non-human or not quite human things or materials. That is the capability of things and materials, from technology to commodities, edibles to ultraviolet rays, storms, chemical tsunamis, just to name a few, to affect and do something. So material constructionism doesn't explain scientific facts, for example, only by the interest and action of scientists, but it looks at how they are produced in and by various material practices which bring together all sorts of actors or actants or materials or entities or forces, and only some of those actants are human. So scientific practices on this account involve not only humans with their beliefs and linguistic constructions or formulations, but they mobilize, for example, laboratory settings, research instruments, methods, formulas, texts, and non-human life forms. You think of natural science. So, on this view, tracing the biography or construction of scientific facts thus calls or would seem to call for a change of perspective. So, we turn our attention from usual minds having ideas to the crafting of epistemic things in concrete material practices. Instead of human subjects standing as the sole creators of things, the materials with which we are entangled with significantly shape our human capabilities and what we are. Scientists, for their part, do not work only with theories, methods, ideas, and language, but they also, for instance, organize materials, do tests, and interpret readings in meters and that sort of thing. So in the process of construction, language does play a significant part. I in no way deny that, but it's not the sole source, or it doesn't have a sole constituted role. It's not only linguistically, if I may repeat myself, or discursively or socially or culturally that things are constructed, but material as well. So to question number 3, and I must say that I really like this way that we are forced to present things. So I have to get rid of this sociologically indecisiveness of, on the one hand, on the other hand. I have to act as if I do. So, what is constructed? You probably noticed that I omitted the term socially. So my answer would simply be that actually everything is constructed, but not everything is constructed socially, and nothing is constructed only socially. So let me explain this better. So for me, the idea of construction follows basically from relationality. Nothing exists solely in and by itself, independent of other things, but everything exists only in relation to other things. To be is to be related, if one wishes to have a formula. We never encounter anything out of its specific circumstances. Things are never completely devoid of relation. So my body, for example, is a construction in that it's not self-sufficient, permanent thing, and not even inevitable as if I wanted that to be that way. But an assemblage, a confederation, a combining together or coming together of various forces, relations and forms, from DNA to molecules to food, oxygen, swarms of bacteria, physical exercise, medical history, chemicals, technology, some norms and ideals of what you're supposed to look like and stuff like that. So instead of first being somebody, to play with the words, and then setting ourselves in relation with things outside our bodies produce and acted in and by these various interminglings. It's precisely through these groupings of these various materials, what Alfred North Whitehead calls concrescence, that is the process in and by which many things become one, that we not only come to have a body, but that we also come to are a body, I'd say. Something singular and isolated, but at the same time sort of topologically continuous with our environment. So the becoming of my body unfolds in these foldings. So I tried to tackle questions 4 and 5 together. So how does construction occur and what forces lie behind social construction? So entities, to put it simply, are constructed by the others they're connected to, I claim. So what is more, there's even no need to insert the human subject as a necessary ingredient for construction to take place. Construction occurs between objects, even without human beings there to observe it. I also say that we don't know in advance and in general what materials, entities and forces participate in the construction of a thing. The collective assemblage or confederation is always more or less case specific. So, and this is the problem for me with social constructionism. The problem with social constructionism is precisely that it thinks that it's only social forces that lie behind construction. I mean that it privileges language, discourse, culture. Because of that, I would say that social constructionism is more or less reactionary, anthropocentric ontology. It's human-centered in that it gives primacy to a relation between the human subject and the world, of relations between various non-human entities, for example, of various kinds of shapes. In social constructionism, the human subject claims metaphysical preeminence, and in my view, this should not be the case if we wish to talk about ontology. So, finally, to the last of the half dozen of questions we are asked to discuss. How could constructionism and realism be made compatible or commensurable? This is, without doubt, the toughest one of these questions, and would require more time than I have to elaborate on this point in detail. But let me just say that they are compatible. Much like Dave, I do not regard constructionism and realism to be necessarily incommensurable. On the contrary, I too hold, like Dave does, and Pyyhtinen in his book, The Reality of Social Construction, that it's possible to be, even necessary, to be both constructionists and realists at the same time. The only thing that I do not think that many versions of social constructionism would give us a particularly realistic picture of, say, science, but would claim that material constructionism does. In my view, it adds realism to our understanding of science instead of withdrawing any from it. So, in that sense, I would even suggest, and this I'm far from being alone in here, saying this, that perhaps construction could be actually regarded as a synonym for real, not less real. The fact that the thing is constructed doesn't automatically make it less valid or objective. And without doubt, if we think of science and scientific practices, for instance, the difference between a fact and an artifact is, of course, essential to science. But in order to be as valid, a fact cannot appear as being wholly dependent on a fabricated, or wholly be fabricated by the research apparatus. However, I claim that the difference between what is fact and what is an artifact is something produced in and by the research practices themselves. The independence of the fact is itself an achievement. Importantly, and I will end here, that this should make it possible for us to tell the difference, and I think this is an important point, between good and bad constructions. The hard work done by the scientist and having the facts standing solidly and independently by itself are not contradictory, but they could even be considered to amount to one and the same thing, provided that the work has been done well. So in other words, the artificiality of the facts would not, on this view, run counter to its validity and truth. The validity and truth of the fact depends on whether scientists are able to produce and stabilize the kind of experimental apparatus, thanks to which the object of study can reveal from itself something new to us. So, that was all. Thank you.
I'm happy to see that the speakers don't fully agree on everything, so we can expect some genuine exchange in the debate. And with the custom of giving these speakers the possibility of interacting a little bit after these opening statements so as to react to each other's opening ideas. So I would ask you to do that right now. So maybe Dave wants to respond to what Olli said.
Okay, thank you. I assume that it's obvious that there are some things that we agree on, but there are also some things that we disagree on, so that gives us a good basis to continue the conversation, doesn't it? I'm very conscious that a number of things that you've said are strongly influenced by active network theory, and I'm going to focus my response on those sorts of issues. So let me start off by saying that I think the active network theorists do a bit of a sleight of hand, a bit of a conjuring trick, when they introduce the material to the analysis of the social world, and then move from that very useful, important and valid move to the suggestion that we must therefore deny the social in the social world, which is a conclusion that to me doesn't seem to follow at all it seems to me that it's absolutely possible to recognise, first of all, ordinary material objects influence what happens in the social world. And secondly, that we human beings are ourselves material objects without discarding the social in the process. And it seems to me that when we do discard the social, we lose the idea that there might be systematically different things in the world with systematically different causal capabilities and properties, which of course is exactly the move that Loughbourough makes in actor network theory. He reduces all causality to the notion of assemblages. There are no distinctive assemblages, there are just assemblages interacting endlessly with other assemblages. And in the process he faces, he obscures, he denies the specificity of the causal capacities of different kinds of things in the world. Whereas for a realist, or at least for a more traditional realist, I know that Loughbourough claims to be a realist of sorts. For a more traditional realist, we cannot have an understanding of events in the world, or at least a causal understanding of events in the world, without recognizing that there are different kinds of things with different kinds of causal capacity. Tables have the causal capacity to support objects against the forces of gravity. All tables have that capacity, unless it's broken, otherwise impaired. Jugs have the capacity to hold liquids without spilling them. Different kinds of things have different kinds of causal capacity. Human beings have a whole range of causal capacities, and they can do different things. Things that jugs and tables can't do because of the specific characteristic structure and composition that gives them certain characteristic potential capacities. And in particular, one of the capacities that people have, that ordinary material objects like jugs and tables don't have, is the capacity to think about the world, to communicate with each other about what is happening in the world, to influence each other's thoughts about the world through the ways in which they communicate with each other. As a consequence, to interact collectively in ways that generate kinds of properties that can't be generated by tables and jugs and all those other non-human material objects in the world. And it's that difference that's effaced by this insistence on treating all occurrences as simply one assemblage bumping against another without any specificity to their causal capabilities. And so I have to say that there is something specifically social about social construction. It depends on capacities that humans have that other sorts of things don't. I know the causal properties of the forms of human group that emerge when we interact with each other. But in saying that, I'm not saying that humans are preeminent. I'm not saying that we should give humans primacy in some sort of metaphysical sense. It's also true that there are other kinds of things in the world that have special properties. There are things out there that can do things that human beings can't do. They have their own specific properties, and when you interact with each other, they generate other sorts of beings with their specific properties. Solar systems have important, interesting causal properties that we humans don't have. But we have important causal properties that solar systems don't have. and we call those social. And the value of this concept of social is that it marks out something different that we collectively can do as human beings that other kinds of objects can't, and something which is absolutely fundamental to understand a whole bunch of important things in our world.
Okay, should I, and can I respond?
Sure. A little challenge.
Yeah. First to reply, thank you very much for your observations. Perhaps I think I identified there, I'll divide your points to two, if that's all right. To the point of discarding the social first, and then the idea of different causal capacities. First point is that I don't see, even if I said that it adds hardly any extra value if we name the construction social. I see that the point is not to discard the social. It's only that it's so self-evident that it's also social, in the sense that things are related. Things are constructed in assemblages or in relations, through relations, that it doesn't add there anything to mention it. It's sort of a departure point. And what I mean that the point is not to discard the social, is that it is there and it's sort of taken by. Perhaps say that there's no social bond as such. In our being and activities and in our interactions and relations, we're always so entangled with different sorts of materials that there's no sort of pure social bond or relations which would be totally separate from different kinds of materials. So the other critical points concern the different causal capacities. And I agree, I won't deny that. And of course, in principle and general, like tables and sociologists are able to do different things. It's another thing which can do more and better things for humanity or the world. But I still say that instead of taking it as a given, as something that we sort of decide in advance and beforehand, causal capacity and the different varying causal capacities of entities is an empirical problem. An empirical matter, something to be studied empirically. So what's the point of doing any research if we know in advance and sort of decide in advance what things are capable of? And on what tables and sociologists can do. For instance, what the sociologists can do varies on situation on situations. In different entanglements, for instance, connected with vacuum cleaner, sociologist is able to perform other things than with computers, for instance. So I agree that there are some differences. For instance, like Hacking has said that humans are interactive kinds, that if we say to a human that we categorize them in a certain manner, they react to that and may change their behavior or action, rather than if we say to a table that you are a table, it probably will act in the same manner. So that's my short response. So So now to perhaps some critical points. It was nice to figure out, this is not structured in any proper way, but free association, free jazz. One was just to observe that it was interesting to know that how many overlaps and these points of agreement we have. But I'd say I'd be quite interested to hear what's your point on this. I would say that perhaps it's not just a genuine disagreement on things, but rather a different perspective. For instance, material constructionism could be said to try to explain or cover a wider range of reality than social constructionism. But on the other hand, I can't resist the temptation to get back to some sort of metaphysical preeminence or whatever. But first, to say that as if only humans could do the work of construction, perhaps you could just say that, okay, it's human who socially construct things. But in any case, I feel a bit troubled with the idea of social constructionism, in that it tends to sort of be caught up in this sort of human world duality. It seems that as if reality was consisted of two elements, the human and the world, to put it overly simple. So, while in reference to some versions of realism which would argue that, or would more sort of, in a more obvious sense, go for the human world duality in saying that reality is something independent from the human mind. On the face of it, constructionism would seem to overcome the duality, but it too, I'd say, starts from or departs from the, or takes as a given the duality. And I see that as some kind of problem to have that as a sort of primal relation or primal rapport if we wish to develop an ontology or metaphysics, to put it vaguely. So even if it sort of reconciles the opposing poles, it too tends to be confined with duality inside it, and sets the human and the world as sort of two privileged zones of reality. So I see that there is, I'd say that there is a bifurcation of some kind there. Okay, I think I'll leave it here and try to say something. Thanks.
Do you like going on, or?
Maybe one more.
Yes, thank you. I think there are perhaps more commonality. Perhaps it's inevitable when people from different perspectives speak with each other that they focus on the differences rather than the commonalities. And there are some commonalities between realists and the sort of tradition that you've been describing. But one of the commonalities is certainly that we both see the events in the world as a consequence of many multiple interacting forces. And your way of talking about construction sounds a bit like just causation. Things come about because many multiple things interact to produce them. And I think that you recognised in that contribution that there's perhaps something different about social construction than other kinds of causation in general. So to that extent, I think that there's some commonality of our points of view. You did in your last contribution introduce some more Latourisms that I have to respond to, though. We said over lunch that Latour, one of Latour's arguments is that science is essentially conducted as a matter of rhetoric, and of course he's a master of practicing what he preaches. He's a master of rhetorician, if that's the right way to say it. And he, I accused him of a sleight of hand in my previous contribution. I'm going to accuse him of some more now. This idea that there's something wrong with the idea of social construction because our conclusions about the world should be based on empirical research rather than being given in advance. It's an absolutely scandalous piece of libel, isn't it? Social constructionists don't believe any more than Latour does that the things of the world should be decided in advance, irrespective of empirical facts. And as far as I'm concerned, social construction is something we can observe in a wide range of empirical situations. In order to establish whether we think it's happening, we need to do empirical work. In order to understand how it's happening, we need to do empirical work. There's nothing given in advance about social constructionism or sociology in general, for that matter. This is just one of Latour's rhetorical tricks, I think, in trying to mischaracterize his opponents. And the other of his rhetorical tricks that I take exception to is this idea that everyone but Bruno is guilty of a modernist, dualist understanding of the world. Everyone before he wrote that book, we have never been modern, was guilty of a dualist understanding of the world. Whereas he, of course, has. I mean, it's laughable, isn't it? I'm having a go at Latour rather than you here. That someone could think that whenever someone they disagreed with noted a difference between two things, they were being dualists. Whereas when they notice a difference between those two things, they aren't. Well, the fact of the matter is that we are human, and as humans, we are different from other things in the world. That doesn't mean that, in saying that, I've got a fundamentally dualistic ontology. So I could stand here and say, as I think I did earlier, there's something about tables that makes them fundamentally different from other things in the world. That doesn't mean I've got a dualistic ontology of tables and everything else. There are differences between the human and the non-human. There are differences between the social and the non-social. But you don't have to be dualists in order to believe that. And to be more specific, in the tradition in which I work, I think I mentioned critical realism yet, haven't I? Critical realism tradition in which I work, humans are seen as being part of the material world. So the social is seen as being ultimately based on the actions of human beings. The social isn't separate from the material world, it's a part of the material world. Humans aren't separate from the material world, we are parts within the material world. There's no dualism there, there's simply a recognition of difference. And recognition of difference is absolutely fundamental to even speaking. Every time we utter a word that refers or attempts to refer, we're identifying a difference in the world. Bruno Latour can't write a single word without doing that. So why is it that others who recognize difference are accused of dualism when sorry, I get quite close with rhetorical tricks. I'll stop there.
I'll just sit down. Or stand up. Perhaps it would be best to have Bruno Latour to respond to the critique, but I'd say that he doesn't, or the point is that not to say that social constructionists do decide. It's not saying that it's just that no one should decide right beforehand. It's not saying that someone is deciding that what is human capable of and what is non-human or table capable of. And I wouldn't say that the approach or the perspective is denying differences, but it's a whole matter question if we set one distinction or difference as a foundational one. There are differences between pens and bottles and tables and that sort of things, but why set the human world distinction or difference as a sort of primary, originary one? And I wouldn't also say that the point is to sort of get rid of or exit the sort of dichotomous or dualist way of thinking simply because we can't. It's sort of inherently built in our thoughts and language, but it's more of a manner of becoming conscious of that and sort of taking perhaps analytical distance to it and studying it, how it works. It's more like a form of the forms of thought that we have. We simply can't exit it that easily. It's like sort of the air we breathe. Like our discourse and language is so structured, so strictly in dichotomies. We can't just escape that. And I must tell you that Latour wasn't the first to note that. It was Alfred North Whitehead who spoke about the bifurcation of nature. Latour is actually mainly echoing in Whitehead in that and taking it towards perhaps some empirical settings. So perhaps that's all. Thank you for the possibility to reply as well.
All right. On realism. This is to challenge David a little bit, actually. In your response to the question about how social constructionism and realism might fit together, you focus on the Z part of the formula, as it were, how things are constructed, and it's in line very much with the title of your book, The Reality of Social Construction. You said this process of social construction is real, and here we have the realism about it. All right. Now, and you said it's a causal process. I mean, questions could be raised about this, whether it's always a causal process, whether collective agreement involves a causal process. It might involve it, but that's not due to the causal process that collective agreement gives rise to social facts. Or think of Austinian performativity that also gives rise to social facts. It's not obviously a causal process. All right, these are tiny details that could be discussed further, but that's not the main focus. Yeah. But anyway, so the focus of your answer to the realism question was on how things are constructed rather than what is constructed. And then there was a separate question of what things can be socially constructed. And there your answer was, I think correctly, that many things can possibly be socially constructed, while others are obviously socially constructed, and then there are others that are so obviously, but yet are socially constructed. But then your two examples of things that are not, in your opinion, socially constructed, if I got you right, I find somewhat problematic. You said table and temperature. Now just think of these two examples. See, tables are human artifacts. They are defined in terms of their function. from the human point of view. And they enter our classification systems. They are identified as these functional artificial objects and so forth. And then talking about the causal capacities of tables, I mean, say, its resistance, etc., and knock it, or not it, kick it, etc., etc. Those causal capacities are not dependent on its table. As a table, it's a set of functional properties. Rather, it's its molecular composition, and it's its molecular composition that is not socially constructed, but its table is socially constructed. So therefore, tables are not examples of things that are not socially constructed. Then think of temperature. It's a phenomenological property. And especially if you think of temperature as something measurable, it's a measurable thing. It enters, I mean, it's dependent on our perception, our perceptions, and things like that. And things like that. But if you define it in physical terms as, say, mean kinetic energy, temperature as mean kinetic energy is not socially constructed, cannot be socially constructed. But temperature, I think it's at least a boundary case because of its phenomenological aspect. So much for provoking you on this side of the set of issues, but maybe you want to respond to this right away, or shall we go to the audience?
I'm in your hands.
If you want to, then go ahead. If you don't, then...
Well, let me say briefly that I think obviously the labels that we apply to things are a matter or a kind of linguistic construction, aren't they? The fact that we call certain things tables, the categories is a social construction. But in saying that this table has certain properties, I'm talking about the object. I'm not talking about our labeling of it as a table. I'm saying that this object and other objects that are structurally like it have certain properties. And that, I think, is independent of what we think about. Calling it a table, obviously, depends on our language, which is something that is a matter of collective agreement. But the properties of the object are not... So I think we probably agree on that. So just a bit of a terminological issue about whether being a table refers to the thing or the linguistic category.
I'm inclined to say that the tablehood of the table, defined in terms of its functional properties, is not. It is socially constructed, while its molecular existence is not.
But I think its functional properties are supervenient on its physical properties, which are not socially constructed.
Okay.
I think it's maybe the whole framework of debate is a bit problematic, because when it's, at least in Hunting's book, he talks about the features of this social construction literature, and one of them was that there is a kind of pattern is that they identify something like, X is Y or something, and then it doesn't have to be that way, and it is bad, therefore it should be changed or something. So I think there's a very kind of political nature in the whole social construction debate, and that's what's kind of exciting for many people, like pedophiles and schizophrenic people and homosexuals and stuff like that. I mean, at least that's why the social construction sounds interesting to many people, including myself. But when you start talking about realism and the tables, and it's totally kind of loses relevance for many people. So I understand that this is important for philosophers because they care about ontology and metaphysics and stuff. But for for many people, including those who initiated this debate, I think what is, the juice of the whole thing is about this political nature of the business activities and stuff. So I think we should focus on that thing. I mean, you mentioned that it's matter of fact versus matter of concern and stuff. So I think that's the whole point. That's an interesting thing to discuss.
Well, I agree with that. I only talk about tables so I can contrast them with social construction and show how it's different and how it does lead to politics becoming significant for ontology.
I think there was a slight difference between the two of you. Both of you mentioned this liberating critical aspect of the functions of social constructionism, but only they mentioned the explanatory function. It's also needed for explaining facts about society. But I wonder if that was delivered on Olli's part. Not to mention this side.
Yeah, it's something. Well, I did pay attention to it, but not mentioning the word explaining or explanation about when I talk about scientific facts. That it's something that the approach is, or perspective is something by which we can explain or track down or trace the biography of scientific facts, for instance. But it's, I wouldn't say that there's a huge difference, but so perhaps difference in phases of what we are addressing.
But I think we probably agree that politically it's important. The case of the MP3 file that you have to pay for to put on your mobile phone, I mean, that's a consequence of the major lineup of political power where media corporations have enough power over our governments that they can enforce that sort of thing. That's an important political consequence of the way that social construction is operating.
Sometimes people mistakenly think that ontology is the same thing as materialism, but that's not the case. So the argument that things are in relation to many other things, perhaps even inherently relational, the argument that it would follow from that somehow, that some things can't be social, but they are all on the same level, just doesn't follow. You need a further argument to show that from the relational nature of things, it follows that some things can't be social. But that's pretty obvious. However, when it comes to the compatibility with realism, with social constructivism, neither does it seem to suffice to say that the causation, the activity, is the sort of mark of the real. Since we have several social institutions which obviously have causal powers, they are just as, they have reality in a sense as atoms or galaxies or whatnot. What needs to be shown first is that there's only one kind of causation at play, and that's the same both in the physical and in the social case. Otherwise, we do have a dualistic ontology of the sort. And that wasn't, you didn't show it yet. I mean, furthermore, it seems difficult because the way you describe social institutions was in terms of collective acceptance. And acceptance is, if people accept that this chair is a property of this museum, and I refuse to accept that, say that there are two alternatives, either I refuse to accept it or I don't recognize the norm. Then obviously, the causation case, the normativity that makes things happen, is very different from the fact that things fall with a certain speed due to a law of gravitation. So, a further argument is needed to show that there are not two cases of causation, but one kind of causation at play.
I'm intrigued as to your example of the chair. You seem to be advancing that as an argument. You said there were two different kinds of causation. Is that what you were
Second.
And your argument about the chair
Right.
and your refusal to accept that it belongs to the museum, you seem to be suggesting that there was a different kind of causation operating there than in the case of the gravity or whatever.
It seems so, because the fact that the chair belongs to the museum, the ownership, the concept of property, if it truly is something that follows, however it is that it follows from a collective acceptance, however we can actually have, it seems nevertheless to be a normative concept. And the way it affects people, in most cases at least, is different than the way that, for instance, law of gravitation affects things in the world.
Yeah, and I think that the two sorts of answers to that question. One is to say, well, there are lots and lots of different kinds of causes, and at a certain level of abstraction, that's going to be true. And the law of gravity works in a different way than electricity. In that sense, there are two different kinds of causes, and you know, collective acceptance implements a different kind of set of causes than gravity or electricity. But I think part of my project, if I come to talk about my other group, we've kind of been saying this, is that there is, at a more abstract level, there is one kind of causality at work in all of those cases. There's a form of causality in which events are produced by the interaction of causal powers of multiple objects, and that model applies equally to the case of gravity or electricity or social acceptance. If we're going to establish that, then we have to do some, it's not necessarily empirical, but certainly concrete work on how causality is operating in those different cases. And certainly in the previous book, The Causal Power of Social Structures, that's what I try to do, to show ultimately that social structures, norm circles, and organizations have causal powers that are ultimately based in the materiality of the people that compose those structures. So in this case here, where we're talking about collective acceptance of property rights, then that's a consequence of groups of people interacting with each other, material people interacting in material ways with each other, and as a consequence influencing the material configurations of their brains in a way that leads each of them to accept certain ways of acting and to act in those ways in the future. So it's ultimately based in the same model of causality, the same material realm as gravity or electricity or whatever. That's my perspective. And of course that is fairly fundamentally non-dualist. As you said earlier that you think dualism is a kind of habit that we can't escape from. I don't think it's true that it's a habit we can't escape from. I think that it is deeply embedded in our culture. Lucia blames that on the Enlightenment. I actually blame it on religion, personally. I think the duality and dualism of our culture comes from much earlier than the Enlightenment. I mean, if you look at Descartes, he was trying to say the place for God, wasn't he, by separating the mind, the soul from the body. And I think that the modern project, if anything, is ultimately designed to move us away from dualism, if it's designed to do anything. If there is such a thing as the modern project, which perhaps there isn't.
Well, I've been, a lot of what you're talking about is really about the foundations of physics. I mean, when we talk about reality, it's really, your reality is physics. But you're a social scientist. It's an interesting thing now that some physicists are starting to think and write about physics in metaphysical terms and asking, well, what is the reality as it would be understood by a physicist? And it happens that a book came out just in the last month by a Swedish physicist, but he's one of the leading physicists in the world, and he's a professor of physics at MIT, But he's gone beyond doing physics in this book to say, well, what does physics have to tell us about reality as real realities? And so he would say that even the atoms that we were talking about are not real, at least in the sense that you've been, people here have been talking about it, that in fact, physics really, as it's come to be practiced in the 20th century and now the 21st century, is really all about mathematics. And that the only ultimate reality in physics is the mathematics. And that in fact, concepts of reality as they're conventionally used don't really, they don't work in the world of contemporary physics. In fact, they've been long ago abandoned. And so that would, raise the question, where does the mathematics come from? And but I agree with you, what you just said before. All of this then gets into religion. But the question of where does the mathematics come from will get you to the possibility that the mathematics exists first. And how can that be? Well, maybe God is a mathematician. But anyway, that's just an observation about a very interesting book, but it bears on a lot of things that have been discussed here, but from an entirely different perspective than has been expressed in any of the previous conversations.
No response.
I think that there's one way of, one criterion for what is real is it's not Alexander's dictum, which will do that. It's that something is real if it has effects on us, or has effects.
That's not how a physicist would.
Well, that's fine. I'm not really interested
But
in fundamental physics, to be honest. I'm interested in the utility of this stuff around us now. I don't actually think that our conception of reality has to be driven by the latest view of physicists on, fundamental particles or whatever. I think that we can have an ontology about this stuff here that hopefully is consistent with science, but it doesn't have to be determined by something down there at the very bottom which physicists just don't understand.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to bring it back to, I guess, the first question, which is the politics question. Because I was intrigued when I saw the title of the session, What's Real and What is Social and Social Construction, that I was going to have a defence, a robust, spirited defence of the social and social construction after kind of couple of decades of trying to get my head around environmental politics, which kind of gets caught up between a Durkheimian world that's just discourse and another world where I have to struggle to say, well, I have a right to say this even if I don't understand physics. So there's almost a sort of polarity of reals, and I thought that you're going to give me the answer of, do I have to go off and stop reading St. Bruno? If not, do I have to struggle through Stenger's? Is there somewhere else that sociology could go? And it sort of strikes me that one of the things that you haven't talked about is the creation of social difference, and that's one of the absolutely fundamental processes that empirically all of us are seeing. So, forget acceptance. What I see around me is protest. I see people who are turning themselves into biological bits of artifacts, whilst human beings are being just completely ignored. And that, to me, is a question of the politics of sociology. So I'm saying this is human versus non-human. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're forgetting what sociology, for me, started from.
I would say that, of course, it's important, considering the world we're living in now, financial crisis and the problems created by it. But I would still be a bit wary about dictating what should we all collectively study. That we all should focus on social differences, and that's all. it wasn't your point, but anyway, I'd say that it's an important point, but it's like social inequality, for instance, it's not something all of us should study, but of course it's something that needs to be addressed and studied. Right? I know this is no good answer to your comment or question.
Sorry, it's a bit of a big, huge comment.
Yeah. One of your questions was, should you go away and read Latour? And I'm tending towards the answer that might be other better people to read on the whole. I think that if you want to make sense of ecological disaster, for example, then you need to understand the ways in which, in this sense, I suppose we're on the same wavelength, but the ways in which elements of what's often called the natural world interact with our social constructions and interact with social power and the ways that that influences our social construction. I mean, if the world is going to turn back from ecological disaster, it will be as a consequence of a deeply political process, which obviously is engaging with the materiality of the world around us, but one in which the ways in which we talk about power will have to change. I mean, I don't want to get into the details of it. I'm sure you know much more about the details of it than I do, but it's quite clear that our constructions, our views, for example, of what's property and what's appropriate to be done with property might need to be challenged in the process of dealing with ecological crisis.
Well, I'm just going to raise the issue of property because we have a very tenuous idea of property at the moment, which is only private property, and that is very much contested. So we have this unstable view of property, and we have had only very recently totally different ideas of property in state socialist countries, and so we have quite a big contestation over property. And is there room in your way of thinking for having contestation, which is fundamental to our social life? We can't abstract power from social life. So we have a contestation over power, over our property. We have many ideas of what property can, should, will, does mean. So that's a bit different from electricity, something happening in your brain and some kind of agreement, and then it works this way. Yeah, because in the social world, it can be conceived as completely different.
Yeah, I'd love to dive in on that. I'm going to use something to get one thing that Olli and I have in common, which maybe you don't know about, is that we both work on giving as a social phenomenon. And there's some fascinating examples in that space about the reconfiguration of property. And then the example I have in mind is the idea of copyleft, or which is in the open source software movement. Programmers write code, and instead of asserting a traditional property right in that, which would allow them to do what the recording companies do, that try to sell me the right to change the bits on my phone. Instead of doing that, instead of selling the software that they write, they place that software into the public domain for other people to use and improve freely. And there's a concept of copyleft, obviously contrasted with copyright, which is that the groups of programmers who do this have come to claim a certain kind of property rights over that code. But it's an inclusive rather than an exclusive kind of property right. The property right they claim is the right that no one else can take the code that they have written and use it in a commercial software product where the user is excluded from seeing and reusing the code. So if you use a piece of software like
Linux or Firefox or a bunch of others, you will tick a little box saying you accept the terms and conditions. You probably never read the terms and conditions, but instead of saying that the owners of the creators of the software reserve all these rights and you have to pay to do this and you can't do that, the terms and conditions that you sign when you take a piece of open source software say that what you may not do is restrict other people's access to that code that you've just taken possession of a copy of. So it's a very different way of thinking about property,
But
which is designed to include people as opposed to exclude people.
Is the point of your example to illustrate the fact that there's more than private property imaginable, but
Yes.
we've got a far better example in communism. We've got huge example, whole societies functioning, social relations completely different, industry functioning differently, services functioning differently. We already have that huge example.
I'm certainly agreeing with you that there are different ways, different forms of property, and many different forms potentially of property. Communism certainly is an example. I think, personally, I think that what we saw in the Soviet bloc wasn't a great advert for the future, but I think that there are alternative forms of property that we should be pursuing as an alternative to our current system in the West.
Could I just add one example is gift property. If you think of, first of all, Dave mentioned open software, but you could also think of software crackers who breach copyright codes in order to sort of appropriate which are commodities within the market, to appropriate them as gifts to be given to someone else, which is, in a way, they preserve the things or objects in the ownership or property, because the wares, or however you pronounce it, or cracks, have these signatures where the group who has done the crack sort of labels it as their own, but instead of trying to get money from it, they just want to have some prestige or something like that. And it's property in the sense of giving while keeping or keeping while giving. So I agree with you that there are many kinds of properties and it's always contested and it's not just one kind at a time.
Okay, maybe before bringing this to the end, maybe I can raise one final question about one of our questions, namely whether we should talk about social construction or just plain construction, and the role of materiality, of course, was part of this issue. What about settling this by converging to material and social construction? Because there is no social construction without materiality, and maybe no material construction without sociality, and things like that. And then construction, the plain construction will be a shorthand of material and social construction. Would you possibly agree on this?
Yeah, well, if I can go first, I would go with just plain constructionism, or plain construction, since like both human relations or associations and material things or objects or entities or materials do play a part. But what I try to do in the talk was just to distinguish or contrast the construction I was arguing for, perhaps in a position or as to be something distinguished from the conventional social construction. So I would say that as long as we acknowledge that both do play a part and look at how they play a part, I'd be fine to go with just play the short-handed version of constructionism.
I'm obviously going to disagree with that.
not sure the word construction does much work when we talk about non-social construction. I mean, obviously there are lots of events occurring in which the social isn't implicated. In that sense, I would disagree with your suggestion, the second half of your suggestion. I'm quite happy with the first half of your suggestion, which is that there is no social construction without some material elements of the process. I'm not so convinced by the second half, the idea that there could, and in this sense, of course, I'm being less dualistic than some of the alternatives. I don't see how we could say that there can be no material construction without social construction. If construction just means, if material construction just means ordinary causal processes, I think there's stuff happening out there in the stars with nothing, no element of influence from anything that we would recognise as social at all. Intriguingly, I'm not sure whether Latour would agree with that. But it seems to me that we must have social construction if we're going to make sense of the world. And of course, it is partly material. And of course, there's lots of other processes of causal interaction going on out there without us humans being involved. But we aren't social construction. Social construction is different, it's interesting, and it's important.
Okay. Well, I'll just conclude by saying that this was all nicely constructed, but there is quite a bit more construction to do. I mean, cleaning goes on, there's still a lot of confusion around here. And we can actually continue the process in the nearby beer heaven called Pyyhtinen. That's our custom plan soon after this session. And these guys will be there for further consultation. So, thank you very much.